You've just gotten a micronutrient test back in. There's a lot of deficiencies on it, and now you're having trouble figuring out where to start at. How do you begin to decipher this information? Well, that's what this video is going to cover. I'm going to help you find a starting point when you're looking at these micronutrient tests. And I'm going to give you 3 places to begin, and understand that these are not the only areas that you can start with the interpretation process, but these are 3 that consistently present themselves on the report, and you need to understand what these 3 nutrients mean in terms of the patient's overall health. Physiologically, biochemically, what is actually taking place when we see these 3 markers, and also where does this allow you to take the patient's treatment, their intervention? It's going to give you direction in that arena as well. So let me break these 3 down for you. The first one we're going to look at here is the Spectrox marker. Now, I'm going to do a whole other video for you on the Spectrox marker, but I need you to understand at an initial level here that this is a marker of inflammation, and more specifically stated, a marker of oxidation. Now, when you see that this number is beginning to decline, and when I need to have a scale here for you, so let's talk about this. When we see that this number is under 66, anything under 66 is considered to be an actionable level. Some might look at this and say, the patient's at 64 or even 65%. I don't need to worry too much about that. I would ask you to take pause on that and instead suggest that when we see someone who is just below that threshold, they're right below 66 at a 65, that is an individual whose lymphocytes are already at the point where they're succumbing to the oxidation. Now, take that into a situation where you have someone whose numbers are down in the 50s, 40s, even 30s. These are very extreme states of oxidation. These are situations that exemplify we have an individual who is most likely in a chronic disease state, and this is an individual that needs aggressive attention. We need to get in front of this oxidation because we understand that oxidation is a compounding scenario. The more that oxidation is allowed to progress forward, the more tissues that are going to be damaged. So this is really an indication for the presence of oxidation, and it allows us to start to look and begin to connect oleic acid. Now, oleic acid is an omega-9. It is the most abundant fatty acid in the cell membrane. When we see deficiencies in oleic acid, this begins to tell us, maybe on some level, that individuals are not getting enough omega-9s and specifically oleic acid in the diet. But in more scenarios, what it's specifically telling us is that this is an individual who has significant damage to the cell membranes, and because oleic acid is the most predominant fatty acid in the cell membrane, those membranes are starting to degrade. We're either replacing oleic acid with other fatty acids. Maybe it's omega-3s, maybe it's omega-6s, but it's not the omega-9 that ultimately we want to see there in abundance. This is truly a marker of telling us how much damage, what are the implications of the oxidation. So Spectrox tells us the oxidation, the inflammation is there. The oleic acid tells us that the tissues, the cellular tissues of the body are succumbing to that oxidation. This is a very important starting point because it allows me to begin to tell the story that I need to focus on this oxidation. I need to isolate where this is coming from, and until I can do that, I won't be able to bring this oleic acid level up and truly allow for cellular healing. That's 2 starting points we have. And remember, when you're doing these interpretations, this is all about telling the story. It's about connecting these nutrients together to understand what patterns they're presenting to you, and then how are these patterns prioritizing themselves to allow you as the clinician to be able to set up your treatment regimens. Do you prioritize dysbiosis over maybe endocrine dysfunction? You can do that by looking at these micronutrients and looking at which deficiencies are more pronounced for that individual, and maybe better stated, which nutrient deficiency patterns are more present for that individual. More on that later. Right now, let me tell you about this third starting point, which is panthenate. This is absolutely one of the more common nutrient deficiencies that we see with the testing. It's interesting to me as a deficiency because B5 is not a nutrient we very typically talk about. It may get brought forth sometimes with looking at lipid management. We're trying to potentially lower cholesterol in its panthenate form, but that's not really why we see it on the micronutrient test. Most of the time when we see panthenate popping up on the micronutrient test, it has a direct endocrine association. This association is linked to the fact that panthenate is a precursor to our steroid hormones. We take panthenate and we use panthenate to make acetyl-CoA, which then goes on to allow us to make cholesterol and in turn our steroid hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, as well as others. This panthenate is typically drawn down because individuals have increased demands for hormonal output, whether that's because of cortisol or some other hormonal demand. The bottom line on this is that many patients, and many of us as practitioners included, maybe better stated the populace as a whole, are under chronic persistent states of stress. And as that hormonal demand increases to accommodate to that stress, we're going to increase the demand for panthenate. As a clinician, if we see individuals with this B5, with this panthenate deficiency, my personal rule of thumb on this is that I'm going to figure that as an endocrine dysfunction, as someone who may have adrenal distress or a sympathetic overdrive. There's a number of ways that you could say this, but that is an individual who is in more of a chronic stress state if we see that panthenate deficiency is present. There are other starting points that you can use, but these are three that are going to consistently pop up. And as you see these deficiencies manifest in the reporting, understand that once you isolate these deficiencies, your ability to start telling the story automatically begins. And now, as you start to look at the other deficiencies that are presenting on the report, you can start to align them with these markers, three markers that we've talked about here. So here's just a couple of starting points. From here, we're going to move more into patterns, because now that you have a starting point, you need to be able to build the patterns so that then in turn you can prioritize the patterns to ultimately set up the treatment protocol for the patient.